The galactic capital was a sight to behold, a sprawling city perched upon the surface of a planetary world in the core of the galaxy. Towers gleamed like silvery beacons in the vast ocean of stars, a shining testament to the unity that the Galactic Council had fought to maintain for centuries. As a symbol of peace and prosperity, the city was a constant reminder of what was possible when civilizations set aside their differences and worked together. But today, a ripple passed through the city's tranquility. A disturbance. An anomaly. A ship unlike any the Council had ever seen arrived in orbit. Its design was crude by galactic standards, an old-fashioned craft from a world known only to a handful of species, the world of Raga, a death world, home to the fiercest and most dangerous warriors the galaxy had ever known. At first, the Council dismissed it as an anomaly, a miscommunication. But when the ship refused to respond to hails and appeared to be heading straight for the Council chambers themselves, a growing unease spread across the political elite. The representatives of dozens of species, all of whom had long since come to view the Deathworlders as little more than an antiquated myth, watched in silence as the ship approached. Then, a single figure emerged. Galactrax, a towering Deathworlder warrior, stepped onto the deck of the flagship as its hatch opened. His form, draped in the ancient armor of his people, stood out starkly against the sleek, clean-cut officers of the Galactic Navy. His presence was palpable, an imposing figure of brute strength, scarred by the brutal wars of his homeworld, Raga. His expression was unreadable, his eyes cold with the practiced indifference of one who had seen the worst of life and had come out on top. The officers of the Galactic Council were already aware of his reputation. Trax had been the stuff of legends, a warrior who had fought in the wars of the Deathworlders, a people once isolated from the galaxy. He had risen from humble beginnings, trained in the ways of his brutal homeworld, where only the strongest survived. And now, for reasons that no one understood, he stood before them, a being who had never been meant to be part of this peaceful galactic order. Chapter 2: The Council Assembles. The Galactic Council convened in the Grand Chamber of the capital's Council Hall. Representatives from every corner of the galaxy, human, Xeric, Elantii, Turkel, and many others assembled, their faces betraying a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The news had already spread like wildfire, a Deathworlder had come to their doorstep, and no one knew what to make of it. The tall, angular figure of Supreme Chancellor Theron gazed down at the assembly. His sharp eyes locked onto the figure standing just beyond the council doors, and he sighed heavily. The unexpected arrival of Galactrax had thrown the delicate balance of politics into disarray. "Order," Theron called, his voice reverberating throughout the chamber. "We will not allow fear to dictate our actions. Deathworlders are a forgotten relic, a reminder of the past. There is no need to panic." He motioned for the doors to open, and Kale stepped forward, his gait measured and deliberate. His armor clanged softly with each step, and the room fell into a hushed silence. He was everything the Council wasn't: raw, untamed, and dangerous. "Who speaks for the Deathworlders?" Kale's voice broke the silence. It was deep and commanding, carrying a weight that no one could ignore. The council members exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. This was not a request for trade or diplomacy. This was a challenge. Finally, the voice of Ambassador Laura, the sharp-witted representative from the Elantii, broke through the tension. "You are no longer part of our galaxy's governance," she said with a dismissive flick of her fingers. "Your kind, if we are to believe the records, vanished centuries ago. Your return is nothing more than an anomaly." Kale didn't flinch. "An anomaly, perhaps. But one you would do well to heed. For your peace is an illusion, one held together by fragile treaties and hollow alliances. I have come to show you what you are truly dealing with." He stepped further into the chamber, his massive form towering over the smaller members of the council. His eyes glinted with a mix of defiance and purpose, and the room seemed to tighten with an unspoken sense of impending conflict. Chapter 3: The Legacy of Raga. "You think you know the story of my people," Kale began, his voice steady and calm, "but you do not. Your records are incomplete, your history tainted by your fear. You call us Deathworlders. You call us savage, barbaric. But you know nothing. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in, before continuing. We are survivors. We were never part of your grand designs for peace and harmony. We were cast aside, left to battle in the shadows of the galaxy, far from the prying eyes of your civilized halls. Our world is a place where only the strongest endure, where the very air can kill you and the ground beneath your feet is a battlefield. We fight, not because we choose to, but because survival demands it. The council members listened in stunned silence as Kale spoke, his words like heavy drops of rain in an otherwise calm sea. There was a growing realization among them that the Deathworlders were not some ancient, extinct race. They were alive. They were powerful. And they had come to the very heart of the galaxy itself. You may think you've built peace, but I've seen the cracks in your empire, Kale continued. Your treaties are forged from fear, not trust. Your alliances are born of convenience, not shared ideals. You think yourselves invincible. But I have come to show you your weaknesses. And if you are not careful, you will all crumble under the weight of your own hubris. He stepped forward, his claws clicking against the floor with each step. I didn't come here for war, Kale said, his tone growing cold. I came here to show you the claws you're foolishly ignoring. I came to remind you that peace is not something that can be bought, not something that can be negotiated away. Chapter 4, The Test. Supreme Chancellor Theron's voice rang out, attempting to regain control of the situation. You dare threaten us, Deathworlder? We are the ruling body of the galaxy. Our fleets have driven back greater threats than your people could ever muster. We've overcome the greatest adversaries, don't think we won't do so again. Kale's gaze locked with the Chancellor's. Do you think your fleets are invincible? Do you truly believe your strength lies in your warships and your treaties? When was the last time you ventured into the places where real battles are fought? When was the last time you stepped foot on a world like mine? The room fell into silence again as Kale's words took root. The Galactic Council had long been sheltered from the harsher realities of the galaxy. Their fleets were powerful, their political influence far-reaching. But they had never faced the brutality of true, unrelenting survival like the Deathworlders had. Ambassador Laura stood up, her voice trembling, but defiant. You speak of survival, but what do you know of the galaxy as a whole? Your people have never once had a place in the grand order of things. You've never been part of the Union, never been part of the peace that the galaxy has built. You have no power here. Kale's lip curled in a slight, humorless smile. You are right. I have no power here. Not yet. But let me show you how quickly that can change. He raised his hand and motioned to the massive holographic map that hovered in the center of the room, displaying the galaxy in all its complexity. The Galactic Council is not as safe as you think. You are too spread out, too complacent. There are forces in the shadows, forces you have ignored for too long. I have come to give you a warning. Chapter 5, The Hidden Threat. The holographic map flickered, and Kale's fingers traced a route to a part of the galaxy that had long been considered a wasteland. A sector of space, uncharted and untamed, where civilizations had collapsed and empires had crumbled in ancient times. Here, Kale said, his voice low. This is where the real war is coming from. A faction, older than the Council itself. They are already moving, and you won't even see them coming. I've seen their signs, felt their presence. You call them the exiled ones, the outcasts, the forgotten. But they are rising. They are preparing. A murmur of confusion spread throughout the room. The exiled ones? Someone whispered. But those were just stories. They are not stories. And they will be here soon, Kale said gravely. And when they come, they will not ask for peace. They will take it. The council was shaken. The Deathworlder's words had struck a chord, and though they were slow to admit it, they all felt the weight of the threat that loomed over them. But Kale's final words echoed through the chamber, long after his presence had left the room. The day Deathworlder showed its claws is the day you will remember that peace is earned, not inherited. Chapter 6: Shadows in the Dark. The Council was in turmoil. Even after Kaletrax had left the Galactic Council hall, the representatives could not shake the gravity of his words. Some had dismissed him as a mere relic of a bygone age, an outcast who could not possibly understand the nuances of galactic peace. Others, though, were shaken to their core. They had felt the simmering threat Kale had warned of, something older than the Council itself, something that could unravel everything they had worked for. Supreme Chancellor Theron, always the calm and calculated leader, convened an emergency meeting in his private quarters, far away from the prying eyes of the public. The room was dimly lit, the holographic displays flickering with information from every corner of the galaxy. All the prominent members of the Council were present, including Ambassador Laura of the Atlantii, General Vorak of the Zurich Fleet, and Senator Velan of the Human Federation. They all stared at the map, which was now centered on the barren, unexplored sector Kale had pointed out. This sector, Laura began, her voice wary, it's been ignored for centuries. No one has dared to venture near it. But if Kale is right... Theron cut her off. We don't know if he's right. We've heard nothing of this exiled ones. For all we know, it's a ruse. A lie to destabilize our unity. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his mind. They had been careful to avoid this part of space, a region filled with anomalies and lost civilizations. The stories from the past spoke of monstrous forces that had once risen from the ashes of ancient wars. Perhaps Kale had known something they hadn't. Perhaps the Deathworlders, with their brutal survival instincts, had glimpsed something hidden from the rest of the galaxy. Then we send scouts, General Vorak suggested, his voice deep and filled with the authority of a seasoned military leader. If there is a threat out there, we need to neutralize it before it can come to us. Senator Velan, who had remained quiet up to this point, spoke up. But if the exiled ones are truly as old as Kale claims, they won't just be another faction. They might be a force unlike anything we've faced. I agree with Velan, Laura added, her eyes narrowing in thought. We can't take this lightly. Perhaps it's time we investigate this matter, discreetly. We can't let panic spread through the galaxy. Theron paused, running his fingers through his silver hair. He had been a part of the Galactic Council for decades, but the weight of Kale's warning was different. It felt too real, too ominous. We'll send a delegation to investigate, Theron finally declared, his voice resolute. We'll keep this quiet for now. But if Kale is right, the galaxy's peace is in more danger than we thought. Chapter 7: The Exiled Ones. The investigation began immediately. A task force was assembled, composed of a select few from the Council's most trusted and capable members. A few scouting ships would venture into the disputed sector, tasked with gathering intelligence and reporting back. General Vorak of the Zurich Fleet led the operation, his fleet known for its tactical precision and devastating firepower. They would not take any chances. As the ships departed, they entered the unknown, traveling deep into the uncharted space Kale had pointed out. The journey was slow, deliberate. The sector was as barren as it appeared on the map. No signs of intelligent life. No planets. No space stations. Just the vast, empty expanse of stars stretching out into infinity. But then, they found something. A massive structure, old and crumbling, appeared on the edge of their sensors. It was a relic of an ancient civilization, a station that had long since fallen into disrepair. But something about it felt off. The ships approached cautiously, their weapon systems primed, ready for anything. Inside, they found records, ancient data files that were encrypted with a code unlike any they had encountered before. It spoke of a civilization that had once been powerful, a force that had warred across the galaxy. These were the exiled ones, cast out for their violent ways. But what the records revealed sent a chill down the spine of General Vorak. The exiled ones were not simply a faction. They were something far older. They had once been a part of the Galactic Order, long before the rise of the Council. Their defeat had come at a great cost, and the galaxy had been left to believe they had been wiped out. But they had survived. And they were rebuilding. Chapter 8: The First Strike. Back on the galactic capital, the Council anxiously awaited the return of the investigation fleet. Days passed, then weeks, with no word. Rumors began to spread of ships disappearing into the void. Tension mounted, and panic began to set in as the message from the fleet was finally received distorted and incomplete, but enough to send a ripple of alarm through the Council. General Vorok's fleet is gone, Ambassador Laura said, her voice trembling. They vanished without a trace. The room fell silent as the realization sank in. Whatever Kale had warned them about was not just a potential threat, it was a present, active force that had already struck. Senator Veland clenched his fists. How could we have been so blind? We underestimated them. Theron paced slowly, his mind racing. If the exiled ones had the power to obliterate an entire fleet, what could they do to the heart of the galaxy itself? The stakes had just escalated beyond anything they had anticipated. It was no longer a question of if they would be attacked, but when. Kaletrax had been right all along. But what now? How would the Council respond to such a grave and existential threat? With Vorok's fleet gone, they were vulnerable. They had no idea what the exiled ones were capable of, how many of them there were, or what their goals might be. They only knew that they were coming, and they were ready to strike. A sudden beeping noise filled the chamber, interrupting the grim silence. It was a transmission from the scouting fleet, barely functional, fragmented, but one message was clear: they are coming. We failed. We underestimated them. They are the past. And the future. The transmission cut off. The Council was now in full crisis mode. But as they began to prepare for the coming war, they knew they were not ready. They were outmatched, outgunned, and overconfident. Chapter 9: Kale's Warning Revisited. Kaletrax had returned to his ship after leaving the Galactic Council, his mind heavy with the realization that the Council was ill-prepared for what was coming. He knew the exiled ones better than any of them. He had seen the remnants of their civilization on Raga, buried in the ruins of ancient battles. They were a force to be reckoned with, a forgotten legacy of galactic warfare. But he was not the kind of warrior who waited for others to act. If the Council would not see the truth, he would take matters into his own hands. I was sent here to warn them, not to watch them falter, Kale muttered to himself as he paced through the corridors of his ship. His crew, mostly fellow Deathworlders who had once fought alongside him in the Great Wars, were silent. They too knew what was at stake. Kale's claws tapped against the steel of the control panel. The time for diplomacy was over. The exiled ones would not wait for the Council to come to its senses. They would strike before the galaxy even had time to react. He made a decision. He would return to the galactic capital this time, not as an ambassador, but as a force of nature. The Deathworlders had shown their claws. And Kaletrax was going to make sure the galaxy understood exactly what that meant. Chapter 10: The Reckoning. Kale's warship cut through the stars, headed back to the heart of the galaxy. The Galactic Council had made its mistake, and now it was time to show them the true meaning of survival. Chapter 11: A War of Shadows. The stars outside Kaletrax's warship blinked with the distant light of civilizations, but his mind was far from these quiet corners of space. His thoughts were fixed on the exiled ones, a forgotten faction long relegated to myth and speculation. The warning was clear now: they were not just a relic of the past. They were rising, and if the galaxy didn't act, it would soon be consumed by the very force it had cast aside. Prepare for re-entry, Kale ordered, his voice firm. His ship was small by galactic standards, but deadly built for speed and stealth, a vessel designed to strike fast and disappear before anyone could retaliate. His crew, warriors from the harshest corners of the galaxy, moved with precision as they followed his commands. They knew this mission wasn't just about survival, it was about preventing the collapse of everything the galaxy had come to represent. Kale's mind raced as he thought of the Galactic Council, now fully aware of the exiled one's return, but still too fractured and divided to mount an effective defense. Their fleets had been crushed in an instant. They couldn't rely on traditional strategies to fight this new threat. If the Council was going to survive, it would need something far more powerful, an ally from the very heart of the Deathworld itself. Chapter 12: The Deathworlder Alliance. Kale knew that in order to stop the Exiled Ones, he couldn't do it alone. The Deathworlders, despite their reputation, had always been isolated from galactic affairs. They lived in the shadows, their war-torn worlds too dangerous to support expansive empires. But Kale wasn't just a product of that world, he was its most accomplished warrior, its most experienced survivor. His plan was simple: unite the Deathworlders under a single banner, and let their combined strength stand as the galaxy's only true defense against the Exiled Ones. Kale reached out through encrypted channels, activating old, nearly forgotten connections with leaders from the harshest worlds, the Karnak from the icebound world of Zarthok, the Feryx from the molten surfaces of Ikshara, and the Vulgars from the jumbled death traps of Iris Tan. These were the fiercest species in the galaxy, hardened by their merciless environments and ready for any challenge. "We cannot remain idle while the Exiled Ones threaten everything," Kale's voice rang through the communication network. His message was clear, each word an ironclad promise. The time has come to show the galaxy the power of the Deathworlders. One by one, the leaders responded. The Feryx, a race of reptilian creatures known for their cunning and unmatched martial prowess, were the first to agree. Then came the Karnak, the monstrous, fur-covered warriors of Zarthok, who had never forgiven the galaxy for casting them aside. Finally, the Vulgars, the tribal inhabitants of Iris Tan, a world filled with the predatory beasts that had shaped their entire culture, joined the cause. The alliance was formed. Kale had succeeded in uniting the Deathworlders under one banner. The galaxy had underestimated them before. Now they would show the galaxy just what kind of power the Deathworlders could wield. Chapter 13: The Council's Last Stand. Back in the heart of the galaxy, the Galactic Council was in chaos. News of the destruction of the scouting fleet had spread, and panic had begun to set in. The Exiled Ones were not a myth, they were real. And they were coming. The Council's fleets, now decimated, were of no use. But still, the Council debated, each representative trying to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. "We need reinforcements," Senator Velan argued, her voice rising in desperation. "Send for help from the outer sectors. We need more ships, more troops, or the galaxy is lost." "But who would come to our aid?" Laura, the Atlantii ambassador, countered. "The Exiled Ones will be on us before any reinforcements could arrive. We need to act now." "I have a solution," Kale's voice suddenly echoed through the chamber. It was no longer a request, but a demand. The entire council looked up in shock as Kaletrax strode into the council hall once again, flanked by a small group of Deathworlder warriors. His arrival was met with stunned silence. He had come, not as a diplomat, but as a commander, one with the strength and resolve to take action. "I've gathered the forces of the Deathworlders," Kale said, his voice resonating with authority. "And I'm offering them to you. We will fight the Exiled Ones, but you must accept our terms." Theron, his face grim, turned to face Kale. "And what terms would those be?" Kale's expression was cold. "Your fleets have failed. The time for politics is over. You will put your trust in the Deathworlders or face extinction. The Exiled Ones do not negotiate. They will destroy you, just as they did before." Laura, ever cautious, spoke up. "And why should we trust you? Your people have been isolated for centuries. What do you expect in return for your alliance?" Kale's eyes narrowed. "We seek nothing from you, Ambassador. We offer only survival. The Deathworlders have long been forgotten by your kind, but it is time for that to change. We will fight. We will bleed. And we will show the galaxy the true meaning of strength." The room fell into tense silence. Finally, Theron spoke. "We will accept your offer. But know this, Kaletrax, this is not an alliance forged in friendship. It is a pact made out of desperation. Kale nodded, unsatisfied by the political subtext, but knowing that the survival of the galaxy meant more than his personal pride. Desperation is often the seed of victory. Let us show them that. Chapter 14: The Clash of Titans. With Kale's leadership and the forces of the Deathworlder Alliance at the ready, the combined fleet prepared for its first major engagement against the Exiled Ones. The battle would take place in the uncharted sector, at the very edge of known space where the Exiled One's ships had been detected. Kale's fleet, composed of the various Deathworlder ships, each unique in its design, built for raw power and resilience, moved silently into position. The Exiled Ones had anticipated little resistance. They had underestimated the galaxy's ability to unite against them. But they had not counted on the primal fury that the Deathworlders could unleash. The first wave of Exiled One's ships emerged from the darkness, massive and ancient, their designs brutal and asymmetrical, built for war. The moment they entered the field, the Deathworlder fleet struck. The battle was brutal and chaotic, filled with explosions that shook the very stars around them. The Exiled One's ships were not as technologically advanced as the Council's fleets, but they were more than capable of devastating everything in their path. Yet, the Deathworlders fought with a primal rage that could not be matched. Kale's strategy was simple: strike fast, strike hard, and never show mercy. Each of his warriors fought like a storm made flesh, tearing through the Exiled One's defenses with unmatched brutality. Kale himself led the charge, his warship at the forefront of the battle. Every strike he delivered was calculated, his claws tearing through enemy ships with surgical precision. He fought not just for survival, but to show the galaxy that the Deathworlders were not to be underestimated. The battle raged for hours, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. But slowly, inexorably, the Deathworlders began to push the Exiled Ones back. The tide was turning in their favor. Chapter 15: The Exiled One's True Power. As the final wave of Exiled One's ships began to retreat, a sudden realization swept through the Deathworlder ranks. The Exiled Ones were not retreating, they were regrouping. Kale's sharp instincts told him that the worst was yet to come. From the depths of space, something far larger than anything they had faced so far emerged. A massive, towering dreadnought, far more powerful than any of the other exiled ships, came into view. Its silhouette was monstrous, its weapons capable of obliterating entire fleets with a single strike. Kale's voice came through the comms, commanding his forces with authority. This isn't over. The true fight begins now. Chapter 16: The Dreadnought of Despair. The massive dreadnought that had emerged from the depths of space was unlike any ship the galaxy had seen. Its size alone was enough to strike terror into even the most battle-hardened warriors. The hull was jagged, built like a beast's spine, its weapons bristling with energy weapons capable of turning entire fleets into debris with a single shot. Kaletrax had faced many enemies, but nothing like this. This was the weapon of a civilization that had learned the art of destruction on a galactic scale. Kale's voice came through the comms, his tone grim but determined. All units, prepare for the worst. This is no ordinary battle. The Exiled Ones have thrown everything they have at us. The Deathworlder fleet, though battered and bloodied from the earlier skirmishes, rallied under Kale's command. The Karnak, Feryx, and Vulgars fought with an intensity that only Deathworlders could muster. Their ships bristled with weapons, each crafted for close-quarters combat and survival in the harshest environments. They were not designed for long-range warfare, but their speed and ferocity made them a deadly force when in close proximity to their enemies. I've never seen anything like it, General Vorak muttered, his voice crackling through Kale's personal communicator. This thing is a walking planet killer. But we have one advantage: speed. We have to keep them off balance. If we let them regroup, it'll be over. Kale nodded in agreement, his eyes scanning the readouts of the battle. The Dreadnought's energy weapons were powerful, but they weren't perfect. The key to victory lay in their ability to outmaneuver and outfight the Exiled Ones. The Exiled Ones knew their weapon was their trump card. They began deploying smaller ships from the Dreadnought elite forces designed for boarding actions. These were the real threat. The dreadnought could level fleets, but it was the forces on the ground that could take out entire worlds. "We need to destroy those boarding ships before they reach us," Kale barked to his fleet. "Focus fire on the small vessels. We'll leave the dreadnought for later." The Deathworlder ships formed into a tight formation, weaving between debris fields and using asteroids for cover as they closed in on the dreadnought's smaller support ships. The Ferric ships, known for their speed and agility, were first into the fray. They sliced through the ranks of smaller exiled ships with brutal efficiency, their razor-sharp hulls cutting through the enemy like a blade through flesh. Despite their ferocity, the dreadnought was an overwhelming force. Its weapons unleashed volleys of energy blasts, each one a wave of destruction, but Kale's fleet dodged and weaved with a predator's grace. The exiled ones underestimated the Deathworlder's ability to fight on this level because they had never faced such a brutal and relentless enemy. "Kale, there's something else. There are anomalies," Laura's voice cut through the chaos. "The energy readings coming from the dreadnought, they're fluctuating. Something's off." Kale's heart skipped a beat. He had a sinking feeling that the exiled ones were hiding something far more dangerous than even the dreadnought. Chapter 17, The Hidden Weapon. As the battle raged on, Kale's instincts told him that the exiled ones were holding back. They had no intention of winning the battle with brute force alone. They were toying with them, waiting for something. Then, the unthinkable happened. The dreadnought's core began to glow with an unnatural light. The energy fluctuated, its surface distorting as though reality itself was warping around it. And then, from the dreadnought's belly, a series of enormous tendrils shot out into space, twisting and writhing like serpents made of pure energy. Each tendril was capable of striking with the force of a supernova, sending shockwaves through Kale's fleet. "We need to stop those tendrils before they get close," General Vorak shouted. "They're ripping through our hulls like paper." The Deathworlder ships scattered, trying to avoid the incoming attack. Kale's warship, the Vengeance, was one of the few that managed to stay within range of the dreadnought. Kale's eyes locked on the colossal tendrils as they reached out to destroy them, but even the Vengeance was too small to engage the massive weapon head-on. "Focus fire on the central mass," Kale commanded, his voice like ice. "Take out the heart, and we might just have a chance." With his fleet engaged in a desperate battle to hold the exiled forces at bay, Kale's ship moved in for the final strike. The energy from the tendrils had already begun to tear apart smaller ships, leaving debris floating like a deadly cloud. Kale's warship danced through the chaos, every move calculated, every shot delivered with surgical precision. Laura's voice crackled through his communicator. "The anomaly readings are getting worse. There's something inside that dreadnought. Something ancient." As the Vengeance closed in on the dreadnought, Kale's eyes widened as a strange signal began to pulse through the ship. The energy readings matched something Kale had encountered only once before, a dark relic of a long-forgotten war. The exiled ones weren't just using the dreadnought as a weapon, they were drawing on the very essence of a lost power, something that could consume entire civilizations. "Kale, look out!" General Vorak's voice screamed, but it was too late. A sudden shockwave emanated from the dreadnought, sending Kale's ship spiraling into the void. The ship's systems flickered, barely holding together as the shockwave rattled everything inside. Kale fought to regain control of the ship, his crew scrambling to keep the Vengeance from breaking apart. "They've activated it," Kale muttered to himself. The Black Relic. The Black Relic was a weapon not of physical power, but of pure, destructive force. It could turn planets into nothing, stripping away not just material but the very fabric of reality. It was the exiled one's final card, and it would destroy everything unless Kale could stop it. Chapter 18, The Last Gamble. With the Vengeance still intact but severely damaged, Kale knew that his only option was to strike directly at the heart of the dreadnought. The Black Relic had to be disabled, or it would consume the galaxy. As he prepared for the final assault, Kale realized that this would be his most dangerous gamble yet. There was no guarantee that he would survive this. In fact, the odds were against him, but the galaxy had no other choice. "Everyone, listen to me," Kale addressed his fleet. This is it. We take out the Black Relic or we lose everything. Keep the exiled ones busy while I make my way in. General Vorok's voice came through loud and clear. We'll cover you, Kale. Just get the job done. Kale nodded, his expression grim. I'm going in. He steered the Vengeance toward the Dreadnought's central core, dodging blasts from the exiled forces. As they closed in, the Black Relic's energy flared to life, sending shockwaves through the void once more. The universe itself seemed to tremble under its might. Kale's ship broke through the final line of defense, its hull almost collapsing under the strain. But there was no turning back now. He had reached the heart of the beast. The Black Relic was a grotesque structure, pulsating with dark energy. Its core was surrounded by a swirling mass of twisted machinery, ancient and alien. Kale's heart pounded as he initiated the final sequence, preparing to disable the weapon. But just as he did, a voice echoed through his mind, an ancient whisper. You will fail. Kale hesitated for a split second, but only for a moment. He had no time for doubt. With a final command, he activated the destabilizing sequence. Chapter 19, The Price of Power. Kale Trax's heart pounded in his chest as his ship, the Vengeance, hurtled toward the core of the exiled one's dreadnought. Every warning light on the console flashed red, the hull groaning under the immense strain as the Black Relic's dark energy rippled through space. The universe itself seemed to recoil from the weapon, and Kale knew that every second he delayed increased the likelihood of total galactic annihilation. With a final grim resolve, Kale initiated the destabilizing sequence on the Vengeance. His hands flew across the controls, inputting codes and commands that would shut down the Black Relic, the weapon responsible for so much destruction. The ship lurched violently as the Dreadnought's power systems fought against him, trying to maintain control. He gritted his teeth and focused, willing the ship to hold together just a little longer. Come on, hold together, Kale muttered under his breath. The countdown echoed through his head each second, drawing him closer to the inevitable confrontation. As the core's energy flared, tendrils of dark energy lashed out like serpents, trying to tear through the Vengeance. Kale's hands shook with the effort, but his resolve remained unbroken. His ancestors had faced trials just as brutal, and Kale would not let their legacy die in vain. Then, just as the final sequence completed, a deep, thunderous roar filled the ship. The Black Relic had been destabilized. The energy emissions spiked and cracked. The Dreadnought's dark power began to implode, its own energy consuming the ship from the inside out. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, the Dreadnought erupted in an explosion so massive that it lit up the surrounding void like a dying star. Kale's eyes squeezed shut as the shockwave hit, his ship shuddering violently from the blast. The fabric of space seemed to warp, the very air vibrating with energy. Kale's fingers tightened on the controls, pulling every last bit of strength from the Vengeance to keep it steady. He couldn't let his crew and fleet fall to the exiled one's wrath now. He had to survive. When the explosion subsided, all that remained was a massive field of debris and silence. Chapter 20, A Silent Victory. Kale awoke to the soft beep of the Vengeance's systems returning online. His head throbbed with pain, but he pushed it aside as he surveyed the damage. The ship was intact, but just barely. The Dreadnought's destruction had taken its toll on him, and even now, he could feel the aftershocks of the black energy coursing through space. He checked the comms. His crew was alive, though shaken. General Vorok's voice came through first, hoarse but full of gratitude. We did it, Kale. The exiled ones. They're finished. Kale's heart swelled with relief. But there was no time for celebration. He looked out through the viewport, his gaze fixed on the debris field of the Dreadnought. The exiled ones were not just a threat to the Council, they were a force born of destruction, and their eradication was only the beginning. I'm not done yet, Kale muttered. Laura's voice crackled over the comm. What do you mean, Kale? We've won. The Dreadnought is gone. The exiled ones are more than just their dreadnoughts and fleets, Kale replied, his eyes narrowing. Their true power lies in the darkness they've unleashed upon this galaxy. The destruction we've seen today was only a glimpse of what's to come if we don't take a hard stand. Kale stood up from the command chair, his boots clanging softly on the metal floor of the Vengeance. He turned to his crew, each of them battered but victorious. His mind raced ahead, imagining what lay in the future for the galaxy peace, yes, but at what cost? The exiled ones had only been the beginning of the larger conflict. We need to act now, Kale said firmly. I'm not letting this galaxy fall to another threat like them. Chapter 21, A New Beginning. The Galactic Council had finally made its choice. They would acknowledge the Deathworlders as not just a force of nature, but as protectors of the galaxy. The decision had not been easy. There were those within the Council who still mistrusted Kale and his people. There were murmurs of fear about the Deathworlders' ambitions and their true motives. But after Kale's success, the Council could no longer ignore the power and the bravery of the Deathworlders. In the months that followed, Kale worked tirelessly to strengthen the fragile alliance that had formed between the Deathworlders and the other galactic species. There were many who still resisted, but Kale's actions spoke louder than any diplomat's words. The Deathworlders were here to stay, and they would no longer be underestimated. Kale returned to the Council once more, this time not as a representative of a fractured species, but as a leader of a united force, a hero who had saved the galaxy from destruction. He stood before the assembled leaders, including Ambassador Laura, who had fought beside him every step of the way. We stand at a crossroads, Kale began, his voice unwavering. The exiled ones were but a shadow of the true threat that looms over us. But now, we have the power to shape the future. The galaxy is no longer just a collection of isolated systems and fractured alliances. We are stronger together. The room was silent as his words hung in the air. The leaders of the galaxy knew this was the moment to make a choice to embrace the Deathworlders and their brutal strength, or to continue down the path of division and vulnerability. I offer you a choice, Kale continued. Let the Deathworlders show you the way. Together, we can bring true peace to the galaxy. We will fight, not just to survive, but to thrive. After a long moment of tension, the Council voted. The results were clear. The Deathworlders were now a permanent and respected part of the Galactic Alliance. The galaxy was forever changed, and Kale Trex, the Deathworlder cadet who had become a living legend, stood as the symbol of that transformation. The galaxy, once fractured and divided, now stood united against the darker forces that would inevitably rise to challenge it. And Kale? Kale knew that this was just the beginning. He had shown the galaxy the true power of the Deathworlders. And now, he would ensure they never again had to stand alone. Chapter 22, Legends Never Fade. Years passed, and Kale's name became synonymous with strength and resilience. He was no longer just a leader, he was a symbol of hope. The Deathworlders had proven that they could protect the galaxy, not with their fearsome claws, but with their loyalty and their willingness to fight for the survival of all. But Kale knew that legends were never truly finished. They lived on in the hearts and minds of those who came after. As he stood on the balcony of the Galactic Council's central tower, looking out over the bustling city below, he understood the weight of what he had accomplished. His journey was far from over. A new threat would eventually rise, one that would test the unity of the galaxy once again. But this time, Kale knew they would face it together. And when that day came, the galaxy would remember the day the Deathworlders showed their claws and how those claws saved them all.